Welcome back. Now, as promised, how important are road and rail links to a region's prosperity? We've been on a train journey with a Norfolk MP who says that faster and more reliable transport would be a huge boost for the region's high-tech economy.
Scientists finding out how much information they can get from our fingerprints. Just some of the innovative work that takes place at Norwich Research Park. It's part of a cluster of institutions and small companies at the forefront of science, not just in our region, but across the world.
Our scientists at the John Innes, at the UEA, and across the other institutions are world famous in their own right. Probably better known in San Diego than they are in Cromer. So, I mean, that sort of presence is there. But what we have to do is to make sure that people who are going to invest in new companies understand that there's real opportunities in Norwich.
Of course, these Norwich-based scientists are not so far from Cambridge, long recognised as a centre of excellence in scientific and technological research. Just 60 miles by train, but a journey that's too long and infrequent, according to some politicians. We took the train with Mid-Norfolk MP George Freeman, who believes improvements on this line are the key to boosting the economy in the science and technology sector in our region.
There are investors in Cambridge who've literally said to me, George, I'd love to come up to Norwich and support and back some of these new companies, but with the A11 undualed and a slow commuter service from Cambridge to Norwich, it isn't worth my time. If we can unlock this line and have a non-stop fast service, high quality trains, good coffee, high quality stations and platforms, we will unlock much greater traffic between the two and huge value in creation and investment that will flow from it.
Just up the road from Wymondham station is Hethel Engineering Centre. 6 years ago on this site there were simply fields. Now it's home to small engineering companies with big plans. These parts, made by Active Technologies, are designed to make racing cars louder. The company's growing 100% a year, makes £2 million of sales annually across the world and wants to be a big noise in our region.
I've been in Norfolk for 30 years now. We moved out from London with the ambition to work for Lotus Cars, which I fulfilled, and now I'm trying to build a business around Norfolk and generally to support the youngsters of today who want to get involved in engineering.
It's a success story George Freeman hopes can be repeated along this route. His answer, a radical solution to who manages investment.
We're on this line between Cambridge and Norwich with huge growth zoned into Wymondham and Attleborough and Thetford. Well, if we want that growth to be sustainable, not vast housing estates and people queuing in traffic on the A11, then we need to join up the thinking, and we need to have some way of planning housing, transport, economics, jobs, infrastructure together. Now that's why I've made the call for the government to think seriously about creating an East Anglian rail company, putting track and rail back together and creating a vehicle, a company with real investment capability.
It's an idea the government are said to be considering, something which could keep the high-tech economy in our region on track.
Tory MP calls for a return of British Rail shock horror. Now, to debate some of those issues in the studio tonight, still three of Anglia's leading politicians, Charles Clarke, Julian Huppert and Brandon Lewis. I mean, I don't want this to become a kind of Cambridge University versus the University of East Anglia. You used to represent students who were at the University of Anglia and were educated at Cambridge yourself. But the macro picture, you said just before the break, is blindingly obvious. Better transport, better local economy. But does the micro argument hold water?
In my opinion, it does. I think George Freeman's got a very interesting point here. One of the first things I achieved as MP, actually, was a train link at all between Norwich and Cambridge, which didn't exist in 1997. And George is right, it needs to be improved and speeded up. There was an idea from a number of the cities. Norwich was doing it, I think Cambridge was doing it, some others, 2 or 3 years ago, to make a bid for the franchise in order precisely to get it coming back down in the way that George describes. Now, it is an ambitious thought and it is difficult, but I think getting a rail company which was answerable to the region, getting investment into the region to go for the region's priorities would be important, because traditionally under British Rail, under the privatised system, we were really a bit of a spur.
Sure.
And all the big investment went to the East Coast Main Line, the West Coast Main Line, and we got left to one side.
Is George on a flyer there, or is this something that you've heard in other Tory circles?
Well, I've done some work with George on this, and one of the key issues you've got to remember is there's two sides to this. One is a lot of the railways, particularly the stations, are in really key, valuable real estate, so that could unlock huge economic potential that can be used for development. But also across Cambridge, Norwich, energy and engineering Great Yarmouth, and indeed with the software companies in Ipswich, those cities across East Anglia have got opportunities for massive economic growth. They're in high-tech, forward-thinking, innovative industries, and we've got an opportunity there to let the East of England show everywhere else in the country really how this can be done.
But what's the trade-off then, and either of you, because it's a coalition issue as much as anything, whether it is us, the taxpayer, who says, OK, fine, here we go, digging into our pockets yet again to fund these things, or will the private sector say, oh, yes, I'd love to have some of that?
I will say this is one of the key issues with this. When you look at the railway lines, and particularly the stations, the type of real estate a lot of these run has got high value, and therefore could have really big attraction to private industry, private property developers, that could mean it will not potentially cost the taxpayer, but could give huge benefits to everybody.
I mean, I think there are a number of different schemes. I mean, just to pick up one scheme in Cambridge, something I've been campaigning for over a decade, is a new station in the north of Cambridge by the Science Park on the direct line down to London, as well as having other connections. And that can be funded by the council borrowing money and spending that, and then getting some of the money from the extra business that's generated, as well as taking an area which is relatively low-use sidings and turning that into, obviously, very high-value land next to the Science Park, as well as the economic growth there. So I think one can do things like that. For other schemes, I'm pushing very hard for the last bit of the East-West rail link, so that we could connect Norwich, Ipswich, through to Cambridge, and then through to Bedford, Milton Keynes, Oxford, and further west. That is an expensive project, but something I've been working with ministers on quite constantly. If we can get the route, I think we can get that built, but that probably would require some state intervention.
This is a completely key point. You can get private investment, you need partnerships. People aren't good at making these partnerships go. The example I always give is Peterborough. You need a much better interlink between the services into East Anglia and the East Coast Main Line, and Peterborough Station is a big blockage for those kind of changes. There's exactly the kind of resource there which Brandon and Julian have described. The county councils, local, other public authorities, but also private sector ready to invest.
But that real estate that you were talking about in your last contribution, of course, is vested in Network Rail. They are responsible for the tracks. They're also responsible for the stations. And the Conservative Party very proudly said, you know, you're in the private sector, that's where you stay. Is there a bit of a contradiction there?
No, not at all. And what came out in the report just before Easter was something, and a point I made in the House itself, is that we have got to look at a different alternative. And the Secretary of State said we are starting now to look, particularly with the new franchises, how we can unlock those potential leaseholds and freeholds to make use of that real estate and get private investment in that can actually see this kind of development. So there is an opportunity there.
As an aside, Abellio, the company which has just, the Dutch company which has got the franchise here, which I think is a very progressive and interesting company. I know them well. I think they're exactly the kind of company who, if propositions of this kind came along, they'd be ready to talk Turkey about what might be done.
And they are interested. We are, the members of Parliament all across Norfolk certainly have been talking to them, and they are very interested in this kind of project.
Yeah, I mean, the same is true very much with Cambridge. I think there's a lot of creativity. I think what we need to do is to move on from the ideological argument about whether the rail should be private or public, and actually to what provides the best service. And I think we'd all agree that that's actually what we need.
But also that's intriguing coming out of this conversation, given Labour, Liberal Democrat, Conservative. Final point very briefly, though, what do the public do about it if they happen to be Peterborough or Norwich or Cambridge residents? How do they get into that argument?
Well, there's no reason at all why the publicly elected bodies, for example the local councils, can't have a say in that process, and that's one of the ideas that was floated 2 or 3 years ago, and I think that would be a very practical way of doing it.
Super. Well, fascinating conversation, and sometimes it's very good when people agree and it airs the issue for the public now to reflect upon. Thank you very much indeed, all of you.